All right, hello. This is Christian Idealism, and today me and Monistic Idealism are going to do a reaction to the debate between Graham Oppy and Bernardo Kastrup. Now, a few clarifications: I have not seen the debate, so this is my first time seeing it. I have no idea what they're going to say. I have
Yeah,
no
same
idea.
here.
Yeah, I have no clue what each side's going to say. So, my initial reaction to this is going to be sort of, like I haven't prepared anything. So anything I say is just gonna come right out of my head, basically. So yeah, anyways, let's get started then with this. Oh, also let me know if you want me to stop Monistic.
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Like many of you in the chat, I'm very excited for this discussion between Bernardo Kastrup and Graham Oppy. Two people who, very intelligent, and I don't think that they've talked before, but they're very, Graham's very influential in the kind of theism and atheism space. Bernardo's very influential in the kind of idealism and physicalism space, in terms of doing these sorts of interviews and conversations online. So, like many people, I'm interested to see, where the disagreement is going to be between the two of them and what they have to say to each other today. So I have billed this conversation as physicalism versus idealism, but and the reason that I've done that is because I know Graham identifies his own position as naturalism, and Bernardo considers his own position to be naturalism as well. So it wouldn't be appropriate to say naturalism versus physicalism in that sense. So I'm wondering, Graham, if you want to just first talk about what your position is and how you would distinguish it from idealism, and then Bernardo, if you want to talk about whether you agree with that and what idealism is, so we know what we're talking about in the first place.
Okay, so first of all, on the label, the naturalism versus physicalism, I think of my view as supposing that there's a natural reality which is constituted out of natural stuff. The natural stuff includes, the natural, the category includes the physical, but I think that it includes more. It includes the chemical, biological, the psychological, and so on. The foundation for the view is going to be where I think the sources of knowledge is across all of the sciences, including the social sciences and the humanities. So I don't think that there's anything like a reduction to physics that you could describe all of reality in terms of physics. That's why I don't want to call myself a physicalist.
What do you think about that's interesting? I didn't know that was his exact view.
Yeah, because I'm sure he'll probably clarify a few things.
Yeah,
but he talks about how what he means by natural. He says, yeah, there's physics, but it also includes chemistry and biology. But a lot of times people try to describe biology and chemistry in terms of physics and stuff like that, unless he's taking kind of a non-reductionist approach.
Well, that's what I was about to say. It seems he's a non-reductionist, and Bernardo would, Bernardo is actually an extreme reductionist. So this will be interesting to see what they have to say on that. But yeah, this is my first time. I've read Graham a lot, but to actually hear him say this specifically, this is his exact view. I think helps clarify for the audience that Graham Oppy is not a reductionist. It seems like so. But anyways, let's continue.
What would be the key? What would be the key difference in terms of how you're understanding idealism between your view and an idealist position then?
Okay, so for idealists, the way that I understand idealism, what's fundamental is minds and ideas. So that's what lies at the basis of reality. Whereas according to me, minds and ideas are late and local in the history of natural reality. Reality itself is, I can use, I'll say material, but that's how you might have described this.
Should I speed this up a little bit?
because I'm okay.
You
Personally. But
okay?
if you want to speed it up, by all means, I don't mind.
Okay, just a look. I'll just hopefully maybe this will work.
Kind of view, say, in the 17th or 18th century,
Okay,
is
no.
not exactly right, given our current understanding.
Let's just do normal
the-
speed.
The sort of fundamentals of physics, but that will do.
So do you want to come in on that, Bernardo? How would you characterize your own position?
Well, I guess, hold on, we'll do a little pause here real fast.
Yeah.
So to me, it's kind of hard. Like I said, maybe he will clarify a little bit more, but it's kind of hard for me to distinguish naturalism from physicalism here. And I would like to see if he does get into a bit more detail as to what exactly it means to be physical and what it means to be natural. Because personally, I'm not quite sure.
Maybe he means
What is meant by natural?
reductionist. Because when you talk about reductionism, but even reductionism is not, even that view is not necessarily like, it's ontologically neutral, right? So you can be a reductive idealist, for example. It's weird how he describes his view as not physicalist. But I don't know.
Yeah, maybe he'll
clarify,
get into a bit more detail.
Anyways,
Graham's characterizations there.
Well, to me, naturalism, and to most philosophers I know, naturalism is the notion that what exists is natural. So we are only excluding supernaturalism, which basically doesn't exclude any serious person or position engaged in this debate. So for me, naturalism is it's the idea that nature unfolds spontaneously according to the patterns and regularities we call the laws of physics, and that there isn't a anthropomorphic entity that interferes in the normal, ordinary unfolding of nature on a whim, in a deliberate way, that nature unfolds spontaneously according to its own patterns and regularities. So from this perspective, I'm absolutely a naturalist. I'm not a supernaturalist at all. To me, the difference between what we might call mainstream physicalism and analytic idealism, there are many forms of physicalism, some of which don't really deserve the term physicalism because they have become so abstract that there is nothing physical left in the reduction base. So mainstream physicalism is the notion that at the bottom level of reality, there are physical entities, be them elementary subatomic particles or abstract fields, and that mind somehow emerges out of particular arrangements of physical entities as a byproduct thereof. Analytic idealism states that at the bottom level of reality, there is a field of subjectivity, of simple subjectivity, and excitations of this field are what we call experiences, and that's the bottom level of reality. What we colloquially call the material world, which the idealist will not deny. But for the idealist, the material world is what transpersonal mental processes look like when observed from our perspective, or technically when observed from across a dissociative boundary. So the physical is an appearance, an image. It is not the thing in itself. The physical does not have standalone reality. It's the way something else, which does have standalone reality, look like from our perspective. That's the difference. Now, the commonalities is that both analytic idealism and physicalism acknowledge that there is an external world outside our individual minds, a world that is objective from our perspective and does what it does regardless of whether we like it or not, whether we fantasize that it be different or not. That's a common point. Another common point is that both analytic idealism and physicalism acknowledge that the qualities on the screen of perception are representations. They are not the world as it is in itself. They are our own cognitive representations thereof. These are the main 2 points of commonality, I think. I am not ready to give up on the word naturalism as a synonym to physicalism. I don't think this makes any sense. It's gratuitously misleading. I think it's a rhetorical move because it allows Professor Oppy to basically classify everything that isn't physicalism as supernatural, with all the wrong evocations that this word brings to the table. So I'm not going to surrender the view that idealism is a naturalist approach. Naturalism is a scientific outlook. Physicalism is a metaphysical position regarding the philosophy of mind. These two things are certainly not equivalent.
Okay, so I think I have a few things to maybe add there. I was waiting to see what exactly we mean by naturalism. So if I'm understanding Bernardo right, he's talking about naturalism as if it's a scientific view of the world. And though I guess it depends on what you really mean by science, because regardless of one's metaphysical position, if they're a dualist, physicalist, idealist, they can still use science in certain ways, and they can all still say that I have a scientific view, though my metaphysics will differ when it comes to science.
I mean, in that case, I mean, going by that definition, I would be a naturalist. So, so it gets really complicated when you define naturalism in that sort of
Yeah. I don't think anybody's doing this in this debate, but I know sometimes what happens is some people can mean scientism. And scientism is the view that science is the only way to know, or that it's the best way to know certain things.
But that's I mean, that would be an epistemic view,
Yeah,
right?
and and I'm not attributing that to either of these people, but I know sometimes some people who want to say they're talking about a scientific view, maybe that's what they mean. But I don't think these guys are talking about scientism. I think they may be, if they are talking about it, it's that it's maybe the best way to know certain things. But we'll see what they have to say.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to guide the conversation too much if there's something you immediately want to come back on there, Graham, that you think would be useful, but otherwise I can.
So there are a few things in that characterization that I disagree with. So one thing that I would dispute is but maybe again this will turn out to be terminological, is that consciousness or the mental more broadly is emergent. So I'm an identity theorist. I think that conscious states and mental states more generally just are certain kinds of, states or processes, just are certain kinds of neural states or processes, and that's not appropriately called an emergentist view. Right? Identity theory is something different.
That's fair enough.
So that's one thing. The second thing, I distinguished between the kind of physicalist view and the naturalist view in terms of the vocabulary that you need to describe what's fundamental. And what I think is fundamental in your theory is everything that doesn't get explicitly defined in other terms. Now, I don't think, for example, that you can give a definition of, say, cat in the vocabulary of fundamental physics. I think this is a matter of principle. So the idea that that you can do that strikes me as an extreme view, but that's a view that often gets called physicalism. And the reason why I want to call my view naturalism is to distinguish it from that kind of view. Now, I agree that the word natural is a very interesting word. It has many, many different kinds of meanings, and mostly when you think about the contrast between the natural and the unnatural or the non-natural, natural turns out to be positive. And so I'm quite happy to accept that there's a sense in which people quite generally want to be able to call themselves naturalists because of, after all, the alternative being sort of an unnaturalist or a non-naturalist or something like that doesn't sound good. It would perhaps be better to have some neutral vocabulary here, but in the circles where I'm having discussions most of the time, that is with theists, the contrast between theism and naturalism doesn't evoke the same kind of controversy that the contrast between naturalism and idealism, supposing that we're using the terms that way, does. So I guess we're kind of stuck with, we've come from different places where the label naturalism kind of serves kind of different roles.
Okay, yeah, I think he's absolutely right about that, given that So like Oppy comes from the philosophy of religion, whereas Bernardo comes from the philosophy of mind, right? So technically they're two different fields. And so how they use the word natural or naturalism in each field is going to differ, right? So in the philosophy of religion, right? Oh yeah, you can hear me. I hope you can hear me. But
Yeah, all good.
basically, in the philosophy of religion, naturalism is whatever precludes theism, right? But in the philosophy of mind, a little bit different, right? Because you could have a naturalist view that's characterized as natural, but like it's still idealist, or you could say like there's naturalistic dualism, which is property dualism. The only like non-natural views in the philosophy of mind are typically like substance dualism or I don't know, like maybe certain forms of panpsychism or something. But for the most part, at least naturalism as defined in the philosophy of mind is much more flexible, right? Whereas in the philosophy of religion, it's much more restricted, right?
Yeah, and personally for me, and I might have missed something they may have said, and if so, anyone can
Yeah.
point it out to me. But like, in my own experience, as well as even what I've heard so far, I'm not really seeing a good definition of what exactly natural is. So when people ask me, "Well, are you a naturalist or are you an
It's like, what
anti-nat?"
do you
Whatever, I'm not sure
what do you mean by
what we
natural?
really mean by natural. So when people say, "Well, do you believe in the supernatural?" I'm like, "Well,
Yeah.
I'd have to know what natural is first to know what's supernatural." So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone can point out where I missed where they said what
Yeah.
exactly it is to be natural. Please share it, but I
But
don't think
yeah,
I've seen it so far.
yeah. I mean, the point is though, I think Oppy here is completely correct in that they're using the term naturalism in completely different ways. So
Yeah, there is a sense in which there's a different context there.
Can I ask a question? Not a rhetoric question. It's an honest, sincere question. Professor Oppy, you said you're an identity theorist. So for you, it's not like qualia or experience somehow emerges out of physical arrangements. It's that experience is physical arrangements. At the same time, you said we can't reduce a cat to physical properties alone. These two things sound contradictory to me. How do you reconcile these two statements?
So I actually don't see what the what the problem is, right? So for something to be having experiences, so we'll think of experiences as kind of processes. Say it's a human being, for them to be having experiences is just for them to be doing certain kinds of neural processing embedded in a physical environment in the right kind of way. Likewise for cats, their experiences will be for them to have the kind of
talking
neural
about cats.
processing going on
Oh no,
embedded in a physical environment in the right kind of way.
we just
Maybe
started.
there's some other sort of stuff that you have to talk about, evolutionary history and so on, but that's just what having experiences is. There's no idea that you can, with this identification, it's a theoretical identification. It's not eliminating either half, right? So it's not saying really there's just neural states and there's no mental states. And it's not, on the other hand, saying really there's just mental states and there's no neural states. It's saying the two things are one. That's what the identity theory says. This is the view that Jack Smart introduced in his, I think, 1963 paper, whatever it was called, identity and brain processes or whatever it was called. And I think that Smart was just right.
If I say consciousness is the involuntary wiggling of my left big toe, this is something I can articulate in grammar, in English. It's a well-formed statement. It has a meaning. Consciousness is the involuntary wiggling of my left big toe. That's all there is. It's a physical account of consciousness. But presumably,
well, it's hardly an account of consciousness, right? It's something that nobody would think was a serious contender.
So what is the difference between what I just said and the statement that neuronal firings are experiences in all the qualitative nuance and subtleties of experience, which are not deducible, even in principle, from any physical property of neuronal firings? What's the difference?
Sure.
Why is
So
your
it's not-
statement
it's
less
not
arbitrary than
deducible.
the big toe statement?
Sure, it's not deducible in principle, but as I said before, the existence of cats is not deducible in principle from the vocabulary of physics either. And that doesn't count in any way against the existence of cats.
Okay, this needs the. It's
Wait.
interesting.
Why
Yeah.
wouldn't they be deducible in principle?
Well, that's the thing, because we're the ones that assign the word cat, right? So, I mean, maybe I think I'm pretty sure I know what Kastrup's gonna say, but I mean, that seems kind of odd to say that cats, the vocabulary can't be reduced because we're the ones that make it the vocabulary, right?
Well, because I mean, the vocabulary is really just how we're describing, encoding
It's just a
certain
description.
information, right? If we're saying, for instance, that, like, just for instance, this can sound strange, whatever, like a rock is a banana or something like that. Like if they were really identical somehow, some way, like it's a rock, banana, whatever. Well, then whatever is true of A is true of B. They're identical. There's no distinction between the two. So if mind and brain are identical, whatever's true of one is true of the other. There's no distinction at all. So why wouldn't they be deducible?
Why wouldn't
I suppose?
Yeah, why wouldn't a neuron, be like the feeling of pain or something, So, but yeah, I'm pretty sure I know what Cap's gonna say. I'll let him speak for himself.
Cats, right? So there's no idea that you can figure this out a priori. It's an a posteriori theory, an inference to the best explanation.
So a cat is physical, but is not physical. That's what I'm hearing.
No, that's not what I said. So a cat has a purely physical constitution, but you cannot define what a cat is in the language of physics. Take the language of fundamental physics, say particle physics, and try to define what a cat is. Even in principle, you can't do it.
So what is missing from what can be defined according to the language of particle physics?
So
what is left out?
The concept of a cat, right? So if you think about reality,
the cat doesn't have the concept of the cat. The cat just is. The cat doesn't conceptualize catness. So from the point of view of the cat, if you have given a complete physical account of a cat, what is missing then?
You can't give a complete account of a cat in the language of fundamental physics.
Why not? Right? In principle, if I'm a physicalist, I could say, of course, I can describe the spin, charge, mass, momentum, and geometrical position of every single subatomic particle, elementary particle in the body of a cat. What is left out?
So that wouldn't characterize cats, right?
Why not?
Right.
What is there to a cat more than what I just said?
Well, every cat's different.
Well, every cat has a different configuration of elementary particles.
Was not what you just did. Even if you could do it, and it's something else that you can't do, not even in principle, because there's too much information for you to be able to store that information in order to give the characterization. Right?
We're having a discussion
in
of
principle. It's not
in principle. That's what I mean.
But what's this in principle? In principle, better be possible, right? And according to me, there's no such possible world, right? We're not talking about possibilities anymore.
But it sounds to me like you want to eat the cake and have it too. You are saying, well, experience is just physical stuff because you are an identity theorist. You think there is nothing to qualia but the neuronal substrate.
Oh, hey, it looks like pessimistic idealism has joined. What's up?
I heard,
any thoughts?
So it seems like what's going on here. So Oppy, I hope my mic is okay. Is it okay?
No, you're good. Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. Oppy, he brought up J.J.C. Smart, the Australian materialist. And in one of his papers, I think it's Our Sensations, Brain Processes, or Sensations and Brain Processes, something like that. Smart attempts to invoke the sense-reference distinction in order to bypass many arguments against the identification of mind and brain by saying that talk about mind while not analogous to talk about neural processes, nevertheless have the same referent. So, for example, when Oppy was saying that it is impossible to deduce talk of mental states from talk of neurological states, it is impossible to do that because of a conceptual gap. There is a total, there's no transition that is capable of being performed whatsoever. Now, what the language at work is actually talking about, what we're referring to, albeit we might not know that this is something we're actually referring to, might be the neurological states themselves. So what Smart invoked was the idea of the masked man fallacy. So when you brought up the whole Leibniz's law thing, so yeah, if A is B and B is A, well, they should have the exact same properties. This is the bastard part of identity theory. This is why I hate the bastards, because they attempt to say, well, let's treat experience like Clark Kent and Superman. Let's treat experience like the morning star and the evening star. Now, I would say that you cannot do that because experience has a certain kind of privilege among other concepts that we invoke. It is a certain kind of privileged status, which, if we were to apply if we were trying to filter it through those kinds of distinctions, right? So the distinction between like Clark Kent and Superman, or the distinction between like the morning star and the evening star, we would actually be committing a fallacy. I would say it would be the fallacy of the fallacy of what would it be, composition. So well, it might be the case that we can speak of certain parts of experience or certain aspects of experience as being capable of being filtered through like the sense reference, morning star, evening star dilemma, if you want to call it that. We cannot apply this to the whole. It does not follow because it may be applicable to some of its parts, the parts of experience. It does not mean that you could apply it to the whole of experience itself. So that's how I would bypass what Oppy is saying right here.
Okay, so you think this works to get around the phenomenal concept strategy, essentially?
I would say yes. Now, it involves my own idea of experience, which may not be accepted, which someone doesn't have to accept it, but I accept it, I guess.
Okay.
So
But
yeah,
anyway,
it's. I'm surprised that Oppy, Kastrup, he's coming off as very aggressive, which I think is actually a good thing. I just hope it doesn't land him in hot water. Hot water in the sense of like him overlooking better arguments that he could be making. But yeah, I'll let you guys continue.
yeah, we'll see what else I got to say.
Yeah. All right.
Of the nervous system, but at the same time you're saying, well, I can't reduce the cat to the neuronal substrate of the nervous system because something is left out, and you justify that by appealing to something that is in practice still impossible, but there is no reason to say that it is in principle also impossible to give a full physicalist account of the cat. So I don't know where you are. Do you believe in qualia? Do you not? Are you a physicalist? Are you not? What does identity mean? Why is it different from the left big toe theory of consciousness that I shared earlier?
So it depends what you mean by qualia, right? I mean, this is another thing from the literature that you'll be familiar with, because some people define qualia in a way that make them inconsistent with physicalism or
qualia is experience. It's the redness of an apple, the bitterness of disappointment. That's qualia, is what we feel.
So for example, you look at a tomato and you see that it's red, right? So you have this perception of a red tomato. You're perceiving the red tomato is just a matter of there being certain processing that's going on in you that's connected to the tomato in the right kind of way. So there's photons coming from the surface of the tomato scattering into your eye, and then there's processing. That's although you can, there's nothing else that's going on. So that's what's happening
that
when
begs the
you're
question.
experiencing the tomato. Now,
You're begging the
you can
question.
talk about the qualities of your
Let's keep
experience.
going. Let's keep going because Oppy does. Let's keep going for a bit and let's round this off as soon as because I saw this part and it's actually very, very important. So let's keep going.
And there's a kind of vocabulary for doing that. But what you're going to talk about actually is properties of the tomato.
This is the kind of thing that
Stop right
only
there.
philosophers do, that no normal.
What
Okay, go ahead.
Oppy just did was he is invoking what G.E. Moore did back in 1903, a dualism between consciousness and its object. When he said that when you describe the blueness of blue or the blueness of the sky, that qualia, you're just talking about the object, not your consciousness of the object.
Yeah.
He is echoing G.E. Moore right here. And G.E. Moore, he even says too, as soon as we attempt to glance at consciousness, what we end up with is a total eclipse, blackness, emptiness, an empty transparency. But now whenever we have an awareness of something, so this is another thing too. He implies a dualism. He's presupposing there's that consciousness is essentially just is on one side, right? And the object of consciousness is on the other side. And so also pay attention to the relation of too. This is very important because when he says, well, I am conscious of a tomato, there is a consciousness of a tomato or a consciousness of an apple. The way language is a bitch, because that allows you to get away with so many things. He is implying a dualism between the tomato or the apple and the consciousness of it. Let's reverse it. Why not say the apple of consciousness, the blue of consciousness, the consciousness of blue? Well, how about the blueness of consciousness? You can reverse it and almost invert it to almost if you want to call it to reabsorb, for lack of a better word, to reabsorb the object back into consciousness and avoid that dualism, which Oppy's entire argument here rests upon. It rests upon essentially a question-begging premise that the object of consciousness, so it involves a begging the question through language, an appeal to the structure of language, which is not universally recognized. For example, if we were to go to India and we were to examine idealistic texts, these concepts, which Oppy's entire argument rests upon, with respect to this dualism at work, so the idea of something, this whole idea of this intentionality that he is invoking here, it's in a way, it defeats, I don't want to say defeats idealism from the start, but it doesn't allow a fair, exactly. It's already stacked against you because of the language. If you control language, you control everything. And this is something that the idealist camp is unable to, well, I don't want to say unable to, but that's why, one of the reasons why it's very difficult for it to gain ground again, because like we even see this with Oppy too, when he described what he thought idealism meant, or what he understood idealism to be, which he said, well, what is fundamental is minds and ideas. I mean, like the 18th century called. This is like, I mean, is he talking about Berkeleyism? He even in his article on the ontological argument, he says he's never seen a Hegelian ontological argument. I mean, has this man even read Hegel?
I don't know.
His entire encyclopedia of logic
By
is
the way,
running on ontological argument.
PI, you might want to fix your mic if you can. I don't know if you can, but
Oh shit!
people are saying it's bad, so I just want to fair
Is it like
warn
cutting
you.
out? Like how is it bad? Is it cutting out? Is it
Like it seemed like you're hitting your mic a little bit, but I don't know.
Ooh. Shit. Let's see here. I'll calm down.
Okay. No, you're good. Was there anything else you want to add, monistic idealism, before we? Because I know Kastrup does mention, like, while he's talking. So like while Oppy is talking, Kastrup briefly says like, "Oh, that's begging the question," right?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I should have brought up a long time ago. It might be a bit late, but this does go back to a point that Pessimistic was talking about, is that I think we need to go back to what exactly is the physical. So,
Right.
I think we have to go back to the beginning, right? Because if you buy
Mhm.
into their premise, like Pierre was saying, you can sort of give yourself this
That's it.
disadvantage by
Yeah.
buying into their premise. And so if you just reject that premise,
Well, that's the
that they're holding
thing
on to,
that
you
I've
can just
noticed, is if you're using the language that Oppy's trying to put forward here, then that's it. He's going to win, right? It's guaranteed that he's going to win against the idealist, right? So what you should do then is push back against that language. Be like, no, we shouldn't be using that language when we're describing, consciousness and stuff. So, but
Okay. Yeah, so we'll see what else they have to say.
yeah. All right, let's continue on.
Actually, is the properties of the tomato.
This is the kind of thing that only philosophers do, that no normal educated person falls into this kind of semantic arguments. Qualia experience is where it all starts. It's what we have before we start conceptualizing and theorizing and coming up with all kinds of narratives to deceive ourselves. Everybody knows what qualia is. It's the only thing that we can know for sure exists. It is the only given of nature. If your account of perceiving redness, if you say, well, perceiving redness is only what happens in the nervous system, there is a very strong sense, an obvious sense, in which this begs the question. It assumes the point in contention. The point in contention is precisely whether there is only nervous system processing as the causal force behind qualia, or whether perhaps the neural system processing is what qualia look like from a perspective, in which case it would be entirely correlated with the happenings in the neural system, just as it empirically is. So it is unclear for me still where you actually stand. It still sounds to me like you want to eat the cake and have it too. But a cat, it doesn't have really qualia because it's identical to the physical stuff, but you cannot have, even in principle, a physical account of the cat. So I don't understand. I will leave it to Nathan. I will not insist on this.
Well, I think there might be
keep pursuing it, right? So, I mean, what you seem to run two different things together there. One was the status of the cat, and the other was the status of the cat's qualia, right? So, right. And before we were talking about the cat, we weren't talking about the cat's qualia. Cats have mental states. Perhaps we can't know exactly what it's like to be in the kind of states that the cat's in because we can't be in those states. We're not cats. Right. But that seems irrelevant to the points that I've been making.
I think there was maybe a first point of confusion about defining the term cat. At least as I understood it, it was sort of this idea that whatever the meaning of this natural kind term cat is can't be reduced to, like, in terms of like theory reduction or something. This higher level kind cat can't be reduced in theory. But I think that there was maybe a confusion between theory reduction and like ontological reduction, right? That sort of went on. And I think that led to a little bit of confusion. I don't know if that is helpful at all in terms of progressing.
Right. So what I said was a point about theory reduction. But is there more to the constitution of the cat at very high energy levels, very low kind of spatial grain of resolution than a bunch of physical particles? Answer, no. But that's not in any sense a reduction. Cats are real in the same way that the physical particles are. Right? You can, I mean, if we're looking for a relationship here, we might think of supervenience as the relation. So the the properties of the cat supervene on the physical properties, but that's not a reductive relation, according to me.
It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's not my responsibility to clarify your position, what exactly you mean by dancing around the concepts like this. So I'll leave it at this. I can very clearly specify what my position is and even account for it without ambiguity.
Okay, so let's go back to your position then, because we might as well focus on that for a bit.
I'm happy. I'm happy to focus entirely on my position and be only on the defense.
Yeah. So according to you, at the fundamental level, there is what exactly?
There is just a field of subjectivity. In other words, what philosophers would call phenomenal consciousness. And that's the basic level of nature. Everything can be reduced to specific patterns of excitation of that.
So is that a single thing or many things?
No, that's a single thing.
It's a single thing.
Yeah, the variety of nature is given by then the different patterns in which that thing can be excited, and which is an idea very popular in physics on how you come from unity to diversity. It's through the patterns of excitation of one thing.
So what's an excitation of a field of consciousness?
In a physical metaphor, an excitation is analogous to a vibration. So if a guitar string vibrates, it's being excited. Technically, I use the term excitation in exactly the same sense that it's used in quantum field theory. A radio wave is an excitation of an electromagnetic field, for instance, or to make it more accessible, a wave in the ocean is an excitation of the ocean. It's a certain pattern of movement in a metaphorical way of the underlying thing that exists.
And
here's a possible way to use the Hegelian phraseology. One might support Kastrup here by saying that there is a force and a manifestation. So the force being part in the physical metaphor, the physical analogy, but there's this force which is the fundamental subjectivity, and it manifests itself or expresses itself in various modes. These modes being certain subjects which are in some sense or another included in this fundamental field of subjectivity, but are nonetheless not separable from it. It's an expression, essentially. So there is the force and then the manifestation of the force, so to speak.
Right. Was there anything you want to add, Monistic?
Oh, no, I think that was good.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering, well, we'll see what Kastrup has to say. Is there any, because do you think that Kastrup could use better arguments here?
I think he's handling himself pretty well.
Yeah, that's what I think too. But yeah, anyways.
How are you related to this underlying field?
My personal mind, right?
No, I'm just asking about you.
Well,
I mean, you can think of it as your personal mind about it.
Yeah, to me, the me is a personal mind. There's nothing more to it. And the body is what those mental processes look like from another perspective, from across the dissociative boundary. But I am a part of nature. Everything in nature is either a configuration or a pattern of excitation of that underlying field of simple, raw subjectivity, which in all likelihood doesn't have any higher level mental functions. So in that sense, I agree entirely with you when you say individual minds, the minds of animals, they have evolved over 3.5, 4 billion years of evolution on this planet, and they have become more and more complex. I agree with that, but that is the dissociated part of that underlying field. The field was there from the get-go, because in my view, that is the one ontological primitive. It's the thing that is there before anything else happens.
So okay, so here's a different question. I don't understand the way that you're using the word dissociated. So maybe you can say something about that as well. So are you thinking that there's one big mind that's the phenomenal consciousness, or are you thinking that this is a consciousness that just kind of, I don't know, floats free?
Well, to float free means that it exists in some kind of objective context outside of itself, which I deny. So it doesn't float, it is what exists. If you want to imagine it in a technical sense, today we have 17 different quantum fields in quantum field theory. Everybody's trying to find the unification theory that brings it all down to one. So you can say that, in my view, that one field is this field of subjectivity. That is the categorical basis, the essential nature of that field. It is raw awareness, raw subjectivity. Dissociation. I use dissociation in exactly the technical sense used in psychiatry. We have known of dissociation since mid-19th century or so, but only in the last 10 years has our understanding of it grown really significantly, very fast, with the advent of neuroimaging. So dissociation is an empirically established phenomenon in which what is originally one integrated mind seemingly partitions itself or breaks itself down into different centers of awareness, different centers of phenomenal experience, which contain different contents, different memories, different dispositions. And sometimes they are aware of one another, sometimes they are not. For a long time, we questioned whether this really existed, or people were pretending that this was going on to get attention from a doctor. But now, with studies like the study of Jolanda Schlumpf and her team in 2014 here in the Netherlands, we know that we can even diagnose dissociation through neuroimaging. The images can be distinguished from brain scans of actors pretending to be dissociated, pretending to themselves to be dissociated. And there is a famous study in Germany, 2015, in which a woman suffering from dissociative identity disorder was instrumented with an EEG cap. And when one of the alters, or the subsets of that mind, is technically called an alter, when one of the alters that claimed to be blind had executive control, the brain activity in the woman's visual cortex at the back of the head would just disappear, although her eyes were open. That's not something you can pretend. And when a sighted alter was in control, brain activity would return to the visual cortex. So we know empirically that dissociation happens. It does exactly what idealism needs it to do in order for it to have explanatory power under idealism. And it is literally blinding. So for me, that's the way to account for how I, as a dissociated alter of one field of phenomenality that spans the universe, that's why I don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda, or what's going on in the thoughts of people watching this video right now. It's accounted for in terms of dissociation. Now, let me rush and concede
Hold on, I got a
that
point
we
to make
do
really
not
fast.
have a complete...
All right.
Just something to add real fast. So it sounds like, I'm not sure what exactly Oppy's view is, but it sounded like earlier, he asked this question. So you're starting with this big mind, I guess, right? You're starting with one. So it sounds like, if I'm, based on my talks with Bernardo as well, there is a kind of metaphysical foundationalism going on here, where you're starting with something. It's not an infinite descent or ascent of these many minds, nor are we talking about just a coherent network of these other minds that are somehow interdependent. But he's talking about one mind that is not derived in any sense, and then everything else
Is
the
derived,
plurality of other minds derives from that. So
Mhm.
Oppy's view, I'm not sure if he is a metaphysical foundationalist, if he has this sort of starting point as well. But maybe this will be laid out more.
I studied him for around 2 years. I don't think he holds any view, at least in regards to that question. I think from his perspective, I think as long as it's just naturalism, then he doesn't really care which view is true as long as it's within the category of naturalism, at least how he understands naturalism. I know he does lean towards a view where there's this initial state that's metaphysically necessary, and then everything else is explained in terms of that. But he's, when I interviewed him, he said that, like, I mean, yeah, he leans towards that view, but that's not necessarily like a view that he's dedicated to, right? And the reason why he holds that view is because of his modal theory. So it's not because of arguments from contingency. It's because he holds a particular modal theory, and so his modal theory is going to lead him to that sort of conclusion. So I would say that he leans towards metaphysical foundationalism, but he's not committed to it, if you know what I mean.
Okay, does he believe in a necessary being? Do you know? Or
he says that he leans towards it. I don't think he's committed to it per se, but because again, from his perspective, from Oppy's perspective, as long as it's naturalism, it's just, like, that's all you really need, at least in his view. So
okay, all right. Well, do you have any thoughts? Pessimistic idealism before we move on. Okay, maybe he can't hear.
Oh,
Nope, keep going.
Okay.
okay, you're good. All right, let's continue.
Ambiguous conceptual account of exactly what is entailed by dissociation. We can talk about, cognitive associations and the lack thereof, inferential isolation. Graph theory can be used to do that. I have used it myself, but I consider it's not a complete account. However, it doesn't matter, because whether we have that conceptual account or not, nature shows that this stuff happens and does exactly what we need it to do. And therefore, it could happen at different levels as well. So my contention is that living beings are dissociated alters of this simple, spatially unbound field of subjectivity, and that biology, metabolism, is simply what alters look like when observed from across a dissociative boundary.
Okay, so when you say what they look like when observed across a boundary, so you're thinking that the undifferentiated field actually has differentiation, and there are boundaries within the field. I'm trying to understand what you think is the relationship between you and the field. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I didn't get what you just said.
Okay, so I think at a different level in the hierarchy of nature, I am a dissociated alter of this underlying field. And that's why I seem to have a separate private inner life of my own. And the underlying process is dissociation, which is a process we know happens in mind space. It happens to people. So the inference or the theoretical hypothesis is that it happens at a level above people as well. It happens at the level of the universe. Now, every phenomenon in nature has an image. It may not be a complete image. It may not tell everything there is to know about the phenomenon it's an image of, but it certainly correlates with the phenomenon because it's what the phenomenon looks like from a perspective. So combustion sometimes look like what we call flames, sometimes not. Sometimes combustion does not have this image. Alcohol combustion sometimes has no flames. So what does dissociation look like when observed from the outside? And my hypothesis is metabolism. It's biology. Biology is what dissociation looks like when observed from the outside. In other words, from outside its respective dissociative boundary. And it is the process that creates boundaries within the cognitive space of this fundamental field of subjectivity. The process that creates the boundaries, the separation from inside, outside, here and there, me and someone else, is a dissociative process.
Okay, so I still can't understand this. Sorry.
I have all the time of the world.
So there's an underlying field, and then there's what?
So-
Within that field, you have a differentiation of regions or something like that. And there's a separation between the regions, and yet somehow or other information passes across these boundaries within the field. Something
across
like
the dissociative
that.
boundary. Yeah.
So the dissociative boundaries are real boundaries in
real in
what would
the
otherwise be an undifferentiated field. So it's not really undifferentiated.
Even if there were no dissociation, there would still be many different patterns of excitation of the field, just as there are different notes a guitar string can play, or different dances or choreographies a dancer can dance. So there can be infinite patterns of excitation, which is a form of differentiation. It's not like the field is uniform across its entire.
I'll be heading out for the night,
but dissociation.
but I'll be listening though. So
All right,
Okay.
you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.
Yep.
yeah, thank you.
No
Good night,
problem.
guys.
Night.
So, well, while we're paused,
More-
so Bernardo may already be beating me to the punch with this point here, but there's just a quote I'd like to read by May Sinclair. May Sinclair was an idealist, I believe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. She says, "The facts of multiple personality, telepathy, and suggestion, the higher as well as the lower forms of dream consciousness, indicated that our psychic life is not a watertight compartment, but has porous walls and is continually threatened with leakage and flooding in of many streams." So I think, and that's the end of the quote. So the point is that though there are these boundaries, though there are these lines, so to speak, between these other minds, the lines are perforated. There are walls, but the walls are porous. So this is what allows for these this transferring of different ideas and thoughts and experiences and so forth. Of course, you're not going to have the whole, but you'll be able to have at least some parts.
Right.
So at least that's how, if you want to look at the boundaries in that way, that could probably help conceptualize some of this.
Yeah.
But maybe Bernardo is going to go into more detail.
Hopefully. maybe he will. We'll see. Because it seems like Oppy is just sort of asking clarifying questions. Because I'm glad that he is, because when I read his essay, I could just tell like that he didn't read that much on idealist literature. So I'm glad that he's like asking these questions to help clarify,
Right.
so that he understands the view pretty well. So, right.
More than a differentiation, it creates a cognitive boundary. It creates inferential isolation. It makes it impossible for me to cognitively associate a thought I have with knowledge about what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. That's the point.
Okay, so does it have fundamental temporal properties? I mean, is time a fundamental property of the field? And are we to think of the field in spatial terms, given the talk about boundaries? And
yeah, you went fairly quickly to the interesting questions. I'm happy with this. Without implicitly, at least, presupposing space-time as givens, it's impossible for us to open our mouths and say something. It's only possible for us to write mathematical equations. So if I am to open my mouth and try to explain and help people visualize what I mean, I am implicitly presupposing space-time as a fundamental sort of scaffolding of nature. And I acknowledge that I do this, but it's not what I actually think. It's just a limitation of communication. I cannot communicate without using spatial-temporal metaphors, like patterns of excitation, like imagining this underlying field of subjectivity as empty space, which is what I often invite people to think of it as empty space. Mind is just empty space. When it's excited, then that empty space gets filled with something phenomenal that is recognizable. But I am with Kant and Schopenhauer and some part of modern neuroscience and modern loop quantum gravity theorists, and even the block universe guys, coming from Einstein's general relativity theory, that neither space and time are actually fundamental. They are categories of perception. They are the dimensions of the dashboard of perceptual instruments and cognitive apparatus that evolution has equipped us with in order to make sense of what is beyond us so we can survive. The problem is, in an interview, it's nearly impossible to be entirely consistent with that position, because that would preclude me from trying to help people visualize anything I'm saying. You would have to go down to mathematics alone, and that is not progressive in a debate like this.
Okay, I got something I could add to this here. So I think this maybe depends on what exactly you mean by space and time. So it's too bad pessimistic idealism left. I think he had a lot to say on this.
Yeah.
But Michael Pelchar and several others give a pretty good way to think about how to reduce space and time. So Bernardo, I think he's right to be like, yes, it's not fundamental, but I
Mhm.
think he can also note that, well, what we mean by space and time, if you're reducing it to, let's say, experience or logical constructions out of potentials of certain kinds of experience, like Michael Pelchar does. Peter Els is another example of this. He has his own reduction of space and time. So if you deal with that, you can say that, well, it's not that I need this talk of space and time to use this metaphor, this language. You can just say, I have to use experience, right? What I
Yeah.
actually mean by space, what is space and what is time anyway, is just the certain experiences that I'm having or that anyone's having or just in general. So instead of falling into this, oh, I have to use spatial temporal language, you could say, well, I have to use experiential language.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting what Oppy has to say on, at least on this point, because I don't know if Oppy is aware of that sort of view where space and time are not fundamental, but we'll see what he has to say on that.
It's not clear though that this. So what you're thinking that there's this phenomenal field that doesn't have a temporal dimension, right?
Not fundamentally.
That's what you're saying. So
Yeah.
is it? So are we to think of it as a single unchanging distribution, right? Because we have no time, we have no causation. So I'm assuming that this is a kind of that's the picture. There's no change.
I sympathize with the difficulty. I have faced it myself, and I've talked to many people who face it. Look, it's not only me saying that space-time is not fundamental. We have a whole drove of physicists today doing loop quantum gravity and saying that at least time is not fundamental. We have people in neuroscience saying that time is extremely relative, and arguably the relativity of space-time is a direct implication of Einstein's general relativity theory and the blocked universe idea. So it's not only me, but it's me too. So I would take the responsibility for that as if it were only me saying it. One way to try to visualize the structure of existence without immediately appealing to space-time metaphors or space-time extension is to think of that structure as the structure in a database. It's an associative structure. The records in a database are associated with each other according to some criterion. For instance, a person has a certain date of birth, which is associated with somebody else who happens to have the same date of birth, or somebody whose mother has that same date of birth, which links to a place, which associates with somebody else who lives in that place. Now, these associative links in a database do not need spatial temporal extension to be spoken of. There is an associative structure there that is semantic in nature. It's cognitive in nature. It has to do with how meanings lead to other meanings. And the spatial temporal extension is an implementation of the database, for instance, in circuit patterns, which have spatial temporal extension. But that's the way to try to visualize it without betraying the notion that space-time is not fundamental. Think of it as an associative cognitive structure. It has structure, and that structure does not, in principle, require spatial temporal extension. because it's a structure given by meaning associations. We can visualize it with extension. We can implement it by means of extension, but there is a sense in which the structure itself, in and of itself, does not need extension. That's the way to think about what's really going on.
Okay, so I've thought for quite a while that it might be that if you think about reality generally, that parts of it aren't temporal, but probably all the parts of it are causal. That's not quite the idea that you've got, because you've got a different kind of link, not a causal link, but an associative link of some kind. So I'm not unhappy with that. I think I understand that part of the picture.
Look, I'll confess something. I am, and I know it's a weakness, but I'm pretty much married to causality. I have a lot of difficulty thinking of things in non-causal terms. But if you put me against a wall and put a gun in my face and ask me, Bernardo, at the very most foundational level of nature, is causality fundamental? Then I would say no. I would say causality is an epistemic account of associations that are out there beyond our personal minds. There is a metaphor, I forgot who used this metaphor. It's not mine, so I shouldn't take credit for it, but the metaphor is the following. Imagine that you're sitting on one side of a fence, and it's a solid fence, planks of wood, one next to each other, and you can't see the other side, except for a tiny little slit between two planks. And through that slit, you can see what's happening on the other side, and a cat walks by on the other side. And you first see the cat's head, then you see the cat's body, then you see the cat's tail. And the tail always follows the head. First the head comes, and then shortly afterwards, there comes the tail. If you didn't know better, you would say the head causes the tail. It happens every time you see a head. Shortly afterward, pop, there comes the tail. It's a direct causation. But if you know what's going on beyond the limitations of the slit, you would say, well, causality is an epistemic model we make given our cognitive limitations. What's going on in reality is that there is just a cat. There is a pattern that exists all at once. And it's our cognitive limitations that lead to the notion of causality. So
that's I mean, I love that analogy. What do you think? Because that really, I think, captures the whole four-dimensional aspect, where time is like, you would think that one thing caused another, but in reality, it's all one part of this whole. I don't know. What do you think about that?
That's interesting. I haven't really thought about that too much. That's a very interesting perspective. I tend to think in a very causal way. Like Bernardo was saying, I do tend to see causality as fundamental, but I don't know. I guess maybe we'll see if he has justification as to why he thinks that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a theist, so God wouldn't be caused by anything.
Right? Yeah, right. So like he would be the first cause, as we say, right?
Yeah.
At least if you're taking more of this like Aristotelian kind of perspective, whatever. But if causality is not fundamental, I'm interested to see, well then,
how do you get causality?
Right. What's happening here? How are we getting? So I guess would they have to appeal to some association model,
Maybe.
or somehow you will get causality from these associate, or is this ultimately a reduction of causality to these associations or something? Maybe that's what's going on here.
Yeah,
but
maybe he'll clarify his view. I'm kind of surprised that Oppy hasn't had too many objections, but we'll see what happens there. All right.
That's what I would say if a gun is put to my head, but I'm not consistent with this view in my normal talking. I talk about causality all the time.
Right. So, I mean, that little story is nice because the cats never walk backwards or do somersaults or anything in front of the slit. I mean, in reality, that's an inference you'd be protected from making. Right?
Well, nature obviously has some patterns and regularities that are predictable and fairly reliable, right? We built the edifice of technology based on our ability to predict with high reliability what nature will do. So yes, that the cat doesn't walk backwards is a model for what nature does as opposed to what nature doesn't do. There are things that nature doesn't do. Objects don't fall upwards. So that's the metaphor for the cat that only walks forward. Oh, this is going more friendly than I anticipated.
So I wanted to ask you some questions about agency and where that fits into the picture, because it seems it's got to come in at a fairly high level. There's a lot of, I mean, the ordinary way that I think about myself and about other creatures is that we're embodied, and our sense of agency is very sort of fundamental to us. But you've got no causation at the lower levels, and our ability to cause things is sort of fundamental to our sense of agency. So it turns out that we're, in a kind of fairly deep sense, not very fundamental beings, right?
As individual beings, no, we are not fundamental at all. I would even question whether there is any strong sense in which we actually exist as individual beings. I think the case to say that we are individual entities is stronger for living beings than it is for non-living objects. There is no case for saying that there is an ontological distinction between objects in nature. The boundary across inanimate objects is purely nominal. It's epistemic. It's done on the basis of convenience. There is nothing ontic up there that could substantiate separating the river from the ocean. But for our own individual minds, there is an ontic basis. If a photon hits the wall, I don't register anything. But if a photon hits my retina, I do see something. If you prick my skin with a needle, I feel something. If you prick my chair, I don't. And by doing this kind of silly experimentation, you can see where the boundaries of your individual being lie. But I would then rush and say, yes, so there is an ontic story to be told. It's better than the separation between inanimate objects. But ultimately, if we are just dissociative processes, then our reality has the same status as the reality of the multiple personalities of a patient with dissociative identity disorder. There is a sense in which they are real because they are experienced as such, but there is another strong sense in which they're not real at all. It's one person doing all that. It's always that person. And in that sense, I don't think we are ultimately real. I don't know whether that's what you meant.
Yeah, that's more or less where I was going to. So I do think that we sort of come at this from very different perspectives, and the difference in the perspectives is reflected in kind of different approaches to, for example, the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Because there are some people who think that really there's a kind of requirement, decoherence. You better be able to get back the common sense world, material world that we live in. And that kind of approach to quantum mechanics strikes me as much more plausible than the kind of unsurprisingly, than the idealistic interpretations of quantum mechanics.
I can comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So this is, and this is not a criticism of you any more than it is a criticism of any educated person who concludes the same thing. Decoherence is not an interpretation. Decoherence is a operational device that's very useful in practice for daily laboratory experiments, but it doesn't account at all for the measurement problem. Zurek, one of the fathers of decoherence, is on record just stating that explicitly. Eric Joost states that explicitly, the fathers of decoherence. But if you understand decoherence, you understand this. The idea of decoherence is the following. A system in a quantum superposition has information associated with the superposition. And as long as that system is isolated from the classical environment that's not in a superposition, that information is discernible. But if that small system in a superposition interacts in any way with the classical environment, then the information in the superposition, I'm looking for a metaphor that is understandable, but also fair to what's actually going on. It's as if the information of the superposition would leak out and be diluted in the environment. So nothing actually is happening with it. It didn't disappear. There is no collapse. There is only an appearance of collapse because the information in the superposition is now so diluted in the much larger macro environment that is already classic that it's not discernible anymore. So that's the operational advantage of decoherence. But of course, it doesn't explain how the environment became classical in the first place, which it needs to be if decoherence is to have any operational validity, any explanatory power. So in fact, decoherence is not an interpretation. It's not an account for the measurement problem at all. It's a very useful operational tool. But if you ask me what is my favorite interpretation, I would say Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics has now such a degree of empirical grounding, and the formulation of it is such that it's even difficult to call it an interpretation. It's more like an acknowledgement of the necessary implications of quantum theory, an acknowledgement now that has very direct empirical substantiation. That paper by Proietti in 2019 is a direct substantiation of Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics. So I don't endorse Rovelli's metaphysics as published in this year's book, Helgoland. The idea that ultimately there is nothing, and he appeals to Nagarjuna and Buddhism. I don't go down that path. That goes too far for me. I'm still a sort of logical Western mind. You know, there is only so far I can go in spiritual abstraction. But as far as the conclusion that physical entities are relational, in other words, they don't have standalone existence. They are not absolutes. They are images that arise from measurement. They are what you see upon a measurement and observation. But what you see is an image of the thing that is being measured. It's not the thing as it is in itself. It's a representation thereof. In the same way that if you're in an airplane and you look at your instrument panel, you have measurements of air pressure and air humidity, wind direction. But those measurements are not the storm outside. They are an accurate representation thereof and relative to the storm. If you don't measure anything, then you see nothing in your dashboard of instruments.
All right, I got a
and
thought
the
to share there.
conclusion of
So yeah, just a quick thought I would share is one thing I would like to point out, I guess, is it is possible to have this relational view of what we call physical objects while also not having a sort of representationalist perspective. It is possible to look at what you call, it just depends on what you mean by physical objects, whatever. So if you look at them merely as just relations and there's no actual like relata to them other than, let's say, the mind or something, well then, yeah, you can hold that without looking at that through the lens of indirect realism or representationalism. Because I know Bernardo was talking about representationalism here, and I just want to make clear that it is possible to have this idealist perspective that is not accepting a representationalist view. If pessimistic idealism was here, he'd be able to go into much more detail on that. But that's what I'll add for now.
Yeah, I also I find it interesting how Kastrup he seems to take the view that you have these relations within quantum mechanics, but then like what grounds the relations is experience. It seems like it's like what the things are is just experience, right? If we're not talking about how they behave, we're not talking about how they behave and stuff, then it's only about what they actually are, right? And what they are is just experience, right? I mean, that's how I sort of understood Kastrup's view. But do you think we should not double speed, but speed up a little bit? Because this is actually like much less contentious than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's funny. Even Bernardo made the comment that he thought it would be a bit more heated.
Yeah, it's not
So
heated at all. I'm actually
yeah,
quite surprised by this. I thought it would be very heated, but we'll see. Maybe
yeah.
Oppy, I don't know, maybe he'll sleeve up his simplicity argument, but anyways.
Yeah, I'm okay with leaving it at normal speed, but if the chat has any thoughts on it, they can go ahead and share it.
Oh, yeah. All right. I'll just keep it normal speed for now. I mean, it'll end in 40 minutes, so
Vella's interpretation is that that's exactly what the physical world is. It's what appears on the dashboard of measurement dials that we call the screen of perception, given to us by evolution to allow us to survive in a competitive environment. The physical world is not the thing in itself. It's a representation thereof. It doesn't have standalone reality. And that's the reason why it's relative. And to me, it means directly, a direct implication that therefore there is another underlying layer of reality that does have standalone existence. Something surely exists. It's not like it's turtles all the way down, relations all the way down, it's like saying that all there is movement, but there is nothing that moves. There is no logical sense to this statement. So I think there is something that moves. It's just by definition then non-physical, because the physical is by definition the image you get of it upon measurement. It's not the thing as it is in itself prior to measurement. Did I make any sense, or did I go far?
So I certainly wouldn't want to go down Ravelli's route, but I don't want to go down your route either. It seems to me that you kind of, where we start is where we have to end up with, a material world, experimentalists doing experiments with material objects. And you can't end up cutting off the branch that you were sitting on when you started. So, that's the way that I'm inclined to see it.
Look, I would much prefer
Can you
things
pause
to
this
be
real
this
fast,
way.
dude?
And
okay, yeah. So
Sorry,
this is what I was kind of getting at earlier, right? It really depends. What are you
What do
talking
you
about, right?
mean?
Because all
Yeah.
right, he wants to start with material objects, right? And look at that smile that Bernardo has.
Yeah.
It's perfect, right? So, because instead of starting with the material world with material objects,
You can just start with a public.
Yeah,
You can just,
you could start with this language of the empirical world, right?
Mhm.
Which means you can just talk about experience. You don't have to say, well, there's a physical material world. Just there's an empirical world. There's just a world that I experience and that we experience.
Yeah, a better term might be like the public world, right? So if you talk about just a public world, I mean that's ontologically neutral, right? That's not talking about what things actually are, right? In that case, it's going to be completely irrelevant. I mean, you can still do, science and stuff with that view. So.
Well, I think, what is science though, right? Because science, usually it's the investigation of the empirical world. It's through experience, through observation. So instead of, giving into that language of, oh, we start with the material, no, we start with experience. And if we're going to end up where we started, then we're going to end up with a world of experience, not a world of material objects.
Right. So that's a really good point, because that's the line that I would use. Where it's like, okay, well, I mean, yeah, we end up with where we start off with. So if you start off with experience, you're going to end up at experience, right? There's nothing within, when you start from experience and end with experience, there's nowhere in there that you're going to be able to fit in material objects, right? So yeah, but anyways, let's continue with what you have to say.
That's the way that I'm inclined to see it.
Look, I would much prefer things to be this way, and idealism would still apply perfectly, because there would still be objective, from our point of view, objective mental processes out there beyond our individual or dissociated minds, which would appear to us like solid tables and chairs, and even without the measurement problem, that would still hold. And I would much prefer things to be this way. The problem is the bloody experiments. We started a series of experiments in the late 70s. I was a child, and the results were clear, but of course, the implication is physical properties have no standalone existence. They only exist upon measurement. They are the result of measurement. And nobody's comfortable with that. We want to find out what the world is in and of itself. So people pointed out all kinds of possible loopholes, which over time became more and more ludicrous, like conspiracy theories about elementary particles conspiring with measurement instruments to create certain correlations. Absurd stuff. But even that absurd stuff, even those hypothetical loopholes, have been closed in the course of now over 40 years. And depending on who you talk to, the jury came with the verdict in 2007 or 2010 or 2015 or 2018, but certainly not after 2018. It's very clear physical properties do not have standalone existence. The world as it is in itself either is non-physical or, and that's the only other option on the table, that's Sean Carroll's favorite option, there are countless gazillions of physically real universes popping out of nothing every infinitesimal fraction of a second for no reason, for which we have absolutely zero empirical evidence. Now, if you believe in that, what do you not believe? So for me, it's much more reasonable to just bite the bullet and say, okay, physicality is an appearance, it's an image. Even when we observe the world through instrumentation, we still have to perceive the output of instrumentation. What is really going on isn't physical.
Well, I think that might be my only contention with Kastrup there. So the many worlds interpretation is just entailed if you only have the Schrödinger equation. Okay. So many worlds, like this idea that there's infinite universes or whatever, that's just entailed if you accept Schrödinger's equation. Now, the question is whether that's ad hoc, right? I would probably agree that it is if we have a better theory. I don't know. What do you think about that? I know because I studied quantum mechanics for a while, and that's the sort of conclusion I came to with many worlds. It's like, it's simple in some sense. Like, it's simple in the sense of like it's an entailment from the equation, but at the same time, is it really simple, right?
Yeah, because some of them, I don't get too much into physics and stuff like that, but from what I've heard,
yeah,
if I'm remembering the context correctly, some of them say it's simple in the sense that they make this type token distinction that yes, there is a potentially infinite amount of tokens here, but in terms of the type, there's only one type for all these worlds,
Yeah.
or all the quote physical world, they'll say, or something like that, whatever, or the realist interpretation. But as you know, there's fundamental issues with that starting point from the beginning, and I think even if you do have one type with the alternatives, I think the reduction of tokens still counts for something. I think having all those tokens still is pretty unparsimonious. And so, but I don't know. I don't, like I said, physics and all that stuff really isn't my expertise.
Yeah. Because I've talked to physicists about this, and what they tell me is that many worlds is the simplest view, but only if you look at it from a mathematical perspective. So in the sense of you only have the Schrödinger equation and you don't build anything into it. So you don't add any other equations, then you're going to get many worlds. But then the question is whether or not, you want to accept that, because they're I mean, he's right. Kastrup's right. There is no empirical evidence for many worlds, right? That's why there's a lot of physicists that are doubting the multiverse hypothesis, because it's just not science, or at least it's not empirical science, right? We don't have any evidence for these other universes.
Yeah.
So
you can't prove it with experiment, I suppose, at least.
So like, if you can make a theory that doesn't have those, right, then that might be the better view to take, because you don't have to assume all these other things exist. So, but anyways, that's the only thing I want to say to Kastrup. Like, I think Kastrup is right in the sense of it's ad hoc in the case, like, there's no empirical evidence, like, why accept that there's these many worlds? But many worlds is a simple theory if you look at it as a sort of, an entailment of the Schrödinger equation. But anyways, that's all I have to say on that.
What's really going on is of the same ontological category as our own mentation. It doesn't mean that it's qualitatively like our own mentation. It is of the same kind, of the same ontological basis as our own mentation. And there are physicists who are very close to biting that bullet or have bitten that bullet. I mean, Henry Stapp is on record having bitten that bullet decades ago. But there are no new up-and-coming stars like Marcus Miller from the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He's not ready yet to make metaphysical pronouncements, but he basically says that physics is the study of our expectations about what the world is. It's our best guess about what the world is. It is not about what the world is in and of itself.
Yes. Yes, that is exactly right. Science, whatever it is, tells you about the behaviors of matter. It's not about the exact nature of what things are, right? And it's funny because, like, if you look at the philosophy of science, you look at the history of science. I mean, this is views that Bertrand Russell held, for example, or what's the other idealist?
Arthur Eddington.
Yeah, so they held that view, right? So I mean, this is a pretty at least it was a mainstream view in the 19th, 20th century.
Yeah, people like Philip Goff are starting to bring it back into light and so forth.
So that view on the philosophy of science, I think, needs to come back because that's basically what it is, right? Science is fundamentally just about the behavior of matter. It's not about what matter is in and of itself, right?
So I really would like to see what exactly Oppy means by physical, because it seems like before he didn't want to limit himself to physics, though, because this view that science only describes the structure and behavior and dynamics rather than the intrinsic nature. This is called structuralism physics. And so if he holds the physical to be something other than what physics can describe, then he might be able to avoid this objection. But so far, I'm really not seeing anything of the sort. So we'll see.
Yeah.
There is that Russian guy who created inflationary cosmology, and what was Andrei Linde? Yeah. In '98, he's on record saying physics is a science of perception. We know that in the beginning, but then we get carried out in our equations, and we forget that we are not studying the world as it is in itself. We are studying our perceptions of the world, what appears on the screen of perception, whether it's mediated or not by instrumentation. And like you, I'm not too comfortable with that because of the way I was educated. I was working at CERN when I was 22 years old. So I sort of breathed certain ideas about what the world should be like since very early on. But it is not a choice. 40 years of experiments, you can't just pretend that it's not saying anything.
So it isn't just the experiments, though, because you have to interpret them, and then you have to be confident that you're not missing something. And when you think about, okay, so what we would be being asked to believe if we went with Ravelli, I think that it's much more plausible that we're missing something than that he's right.
But that's why it took 40 years, because everybody has thought like you are thinking. And we have been closing.
We may have closed off some interpretations. I mean, some understandings, but we clearly haven't closed off all of them. We haven't thought of all of them yet. So I think that my money is going to be on you should be agnostic about what the right answer is here. You should be quite confident that Ravelli's not getting it right.
Okay, it's not only Ravelli, by the way. He was just the first.
Yeah, no, but I'm using him as an example.
Okay, I'll pretend that I haven't followed this story over the years, and that I don't know that incredibly implausible loopholes have been closed.
Yeah.
If you go this far and you say, well, we have to remain agnostic, even about an experiment that has been confirmed and reconfirmed dozens of times by dozens of different groups over 4 decades, if you go that far, then you have to suspend your belief in anything that science says. Then you have to be agnostic about everything. Then you don't know anything.
I was being agnostic about having found the right theory.
No, the experiments are pretty clear. I can describe the experiment if you want. I don't know whether it's useful, Nathan, you let me know, but it's very difficult to interpret the experiment in any other way. But if you say, in principle, we should remain agnostic, I think that then applies to the rest of science as well. And then I just throw my hands up and say, okay, then I don't know anything.
Yeah, so I don't think so. But
I
Like,
can't
you know,
keep-
so there've been times in the past where people have sort of wallowed, a sea of conflicting theories because nobody was able to hit on the right answer, and then we hit on the right answer. From the history of thought, this is not an unfamiliar thing. So I don't see why it's not going to be open as an option, that we just haven't yet figured out how to interpret the various results of all the experiments we've got. I mean, the experiments have been designed to knock out certain hypotheses. That doesn't mean that all the hypotheses that we haven't thought of yet have been knocked out.
I agree. Oh, I think that's the key. What you said at the very last moment, and we cannot discard what we haven't thought of yet. I'm completely with you there. But the power of the experiment is what it does refute. It's not necessarily the final conclusion of what it says. And I agree with you, in the history of science, we have interpreted things in different ways over time. Like Newton thought of gravity as an invisible force acting at a distance. It took the French 50 years to stop laughing, and ultimately they were proven right. There is no such a force. There is a torsion of space-time, which is sort of an equally abstract theoretical thing. But in the history of science, although we have interpreted the conclusion differently, there were things that experiments have refuted consistently. And
Okay, I have to go soon. We're at the hour mark, by the way, for 59 minutes. You want to stop here? We can continue the last 30 minutes like some other time.
If you wanted to, sure. If you got to go, that's okay.
Yeah, I'll be back to, I'll rename the title part 1 or something. We'll continue with part 2 tomorrow, sometime this week, and just finish off the last 30 minutes. But I have to go pick up a friend. I'm not gonna say who he is. He just texted me, so I'm gonna end the stream right now. We can continue this either tomorrow or whenever you're available, if you want. If it's
Cool.
Yeah,
that sounds good to me. All right, thanks
yeah,
for joining us, guys.
I do appreciate it. I feel like the discussion here is really helpful, because I like how Graham is asking questions. So we'll see. Maybe in the last 30 minutes, maybe Graham will bring in the simplicity argument, but I don't know.
We'll
It seems to be a
see.
good,
We'll
good
get to the
discussion.
exciting conclusion in part 2.
Yeah. But anyways, I have to go, guys. Let me stop sharing. But I appreciate you guys for listening. Part 2 is going to come either tomorrow or sometime this week, hopefully.
Right.
Whenever Monistic and I are available to do it. But anyways, I'm going to close off now. Again, we're going to continue this on later, get our additional thoughts on that. So see you guys later.
Good night.